Is this how you fight for justice? By humiliating a man who's done nothing to you? The voice was shaking but firm, words drenched in desperation. A frail, elderly black man stood bound with rough ropes that dug into his skin, his hands trembling behind his back. His feet scraped against the loose gravel of the train tracks, the cold metal rails beneath him promising nothing but dread. The setting sun cast long shadows over the abandoned rural station, and the air buzzed with the eerie anticipation of an incoming train. Standing before him, towering with false authority, a uniformed officer smirked. His badge gleamed under the fading light, but there was nothing honorable about his presence. His laughter was sharp, cruel, piercing through the heavy silence of the desolate area. "You don't belong here," the officer said, pulling the ropes tighter. "Maybe this will teach your kind to stay in your place." The older man tried to speak, to reason, but the officer cut him off with a brutal tug of the ropes, forcing him to his knees. Gravel bit into his legs. His heart raced, not out of fear for himself, but for what this meant, for what this symbolized. "Say it," barked the officer, stepping closer, his boots crunching on the ground. "Admit you're nothing but trouble. That this country would be better off without you." Tears welled up in the man's eyes, but his voice remained steady. "I've lived through worse men than you," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if drawing strength from something beyond the officer's comprehension. "You don't scare me." The officer's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of anger. He glanced down the tracks, listening intently for the distant rumble of the train. It wasn't far now. "Well, let's see if you're still so brave in a few minutes," the officer sneered. "Let's see if anyone even cares to save you." The older man closed his eyes, steadying his breath. The sound of the train grew louder, its rhythm pounding like a heartbeat in his chest. For a moment, he felt utterly alone, a lifetime of dignity and resilience reduced to this single act of hatred. But just as despair threatened to creep in, a sound pierced the air. "Stop!" A voice, commanding and full of rage, echoed through the stillness. The officer turned sharply, startled, as the sound of footsteps thundered toward them. Emerging from the shadows, a figure stormed forward, his presence radiating authority and fury. The officer's smug expression faltered, replaced by a mix of confusion and fear. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The newcomer's voice was sharp, cutting through the officer's pretense. "Stay back," the officer stammered, reaching for his weapon. But there was no room for intimidation now. The tables were turning, and the officer knew it. "You don't get to decide who lives or dies," the voice continued, unyielding. "And you damn sure don't get to disgrace that badge by turning it into a weapon of hate." The older man opened his eyes, his gaze meeting that of his unexpected savior. Relief and hope surged through him, but he could also see the storm brewing in the younger man's eyes, a storm that promised consequences far beyond this isolated moment. As the train roared closer, the officer found himself paralyzed, the power he had wielded moments ago slipping away like sand through his fingers. The situation had spiraled out of his control, and the weight of his actions began to press down on him like a freight train. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. What happens when the one you sought to destroy turns out to be the one who has the power to destroy you? When the tables turn, will justice prevail, or will it devour everything in its path? Stay with us. This story will take you places you didn't expect, and the ending will leave you speechless. We at Plough of Twist stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To our black viewers and everyone standing for equality and justice, know that we see you, we hear you, and we support you. This channel is a safe space where stories are told not just to entertain but to challenge, inspire, and bring awareness to critical issues. Thank you for being here, and we hope you enjoy this gripping story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives. Now, sit back and prepare for an emotional ride, this one's for you. The dry wind of late summer swept across the cracked asphalt of the old railway station, carrying with it the faint scent of rusted metal and wild sage. The station had long been abandoned, a relic of a bygone era when trains were the lifeline of rural America. Now, it stood as a forgotten ghost, its graffiti-covered walls and creaking structures a haven for solitude, or misdeeds. Samuel Harris, a man whose years were etched into his weathered face, shuffled carefully along the gravelly edge of the tracks. His hands were calloused from decades of hard labor, his gait deliberate, as though each step carried the weight of 1,000 stories. Samuel wasn't just any man. He was the quiet backbone of his community, known to everyone in his small town for his wisdom and resilience. Born during the height of the civil rights movement, Samuel had grown up navigating a world determined to keep him in the shadows. Yet, he never let bitterness consume him. His joy came from small victories, teaching his son to fish in the creek behind their home, singing hymns in the modest church on Sundays, and sharing his famous peach cobbler at neighborhood gatherings. That son, Elijah Harris, had inherited Samuel's unyielding sense of justice. From a young age, Elijah watched his father stand firm against prejudice, sometimes with nothing more than a steady gaze and an unwavering voice. Those moments, seared into Elijah's memory, fueled his decision to pursue a career in law enforcement, not as a local cop but as an agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Elijah believed that true change came from within the system, and he was determined to be that change. At 32, Elijah had built a reputation as one of the sharpest minds in the Bureau. Tall and commanding, with sharp features softened only by the occasional warm smile, he carried himself with a quiet confidence. He'd made sacrifices to get where he was, long nights of studying, years of grueling training, and a near-total devotion to the job. Yet, his heart always remained tethered to the man who had raised him, the man who had shown him what integrity truly meant. On this particular day, Samuel had ventured to the outskirts of town to collect wildflowers for his wife's grave. He liked the quiet of the abandoned train station, it gave him time to think, to feel close to her. The station held no danger in his eyes, just a bittersweet loneliness. But danger often wears an unassuming mask. Officer Mark Reynolds was a man whose badge served as both a shield and a weapon. In his early 40s, with a barrel chest and a voice that commanded attention, Reynolds had spent 15 years patrolling this rural area. To some, he was a dedicated public servant, to others, he was a symbol of unchecked authority. Mark harbored a deep resentment, the kind that festered quietly until it found an outlet. His disdain for men like Samuel wasn't born out of ignorance but a deliberate choice to uphold the prejudices he'd grown up with. Reynolds believed in power, in control, and in keeping people in their place. When he saw Samuel at the station that afternoon, something in him snapped. It wasn't just Samuel's presence, it was what Samuel represented, quiet dignity in the face of oppression. To Reynolds, that was a challenge, an affront to his perceived superiority. The encounter began innocuously enough. Reynolds pulled up in his patrol car, the engine rumbling as he stepped out with his characteristic swagger. Samuel turned, offering a polite nod, as he always did to strangers. But the air thickened quickly when Reynolds barked his first command. "What are you doing out here, old man?" "This isn't your land," Reynolds said, his hand resting menacingly on his belt. Samuel straightened, his dark eyes meeting Reynolds without flinching. "Just picking flowers," he replied calmly, gesturing to the small bouquet in his hand. "For my wife." Reynolds' lip curled in disdain. "Flowers, huh? Funny, I didn't know trespassing came with a bouquet." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone measured. "This station's been abandoned for years. I didn't think anyone would mind." "Well, I do," Reynolds shot back, stepping closer. "Men like you wandering where you don't belong, that's how trouble starts." Samuel's heart sank. He'd heard this before, in different words, from different mouths. But now, in the solitude of this place, with no witnesses to hold this man accountable, the threat felt heavier. "I'm not looking for trouble," Samuel said softly, turning to leave. But Reynolds wasn't done. He grabbed Samuel's arm roughly, spinning him around. "Not so fast. You think you can just walk away? You people always think the rules don't apply to you. Samuel winced, the officer's grip pressing into his flesh. Let me go, he said, his voice low but firm. Reynolds smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. Or what? You gonna call someone? Go ahead. I'd love to see how that plays out. Before Samuel could respond, he found himself being shoved toward the tracks. The gravel shifted beneath his feet as Reynolds pushed him down, pulling a coil of rope from his utility belt. What are you doing? Samuel demanded, his voice rising in alarm. Teaching you a lesson, Reynolds replied coldly. You're gonna think twice before stepping out of line again. Samuel struggled, but Reynolds was stronger, his grip like iron. In minutes, Samuel's hands were bound, the rope cutting into his wrists. Reynolds secured the other end to the metal rail, his actions deliberate and unhurried, as if he'd done this 100 times before. You can scream if you want, Reynolds taunted. But out here, no one's gonna hear you. The sound of the train horn in the distance sent a chill through Samuel's body. He closed his eyes, summoning every ounce of courage he had left. He thought of Elijah, of the strength he'd instilled in his son, of the unshakable belief in justice they both shared. Miles away, Elijah was driving back to town after wrapping up a case. He had no idea that his father's life hung by a thread, or that the values he'd spent his life upholding were about to be tested in ways he never could have imagined. The sound of the train horn grew louder, reverberating across the desolate expanse of the abandoned railway station. Samuel Harris lay motionless on the tracks, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. His wrists throbbed where the coarse ropes bit into his skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight pressing on his soul. He wasn't afraid of death, but the indignity of dying like this, helpless, humiliated, gnawed at his spirit. He thought of Elijah, his son, the man he'd raised to fight for justice, and he prayed that somehow this wouldn't be the end. Miles away, Elijah's phone buzzed on the passenger seat of his car. He glanced at it briefly, a message from a neighbor he hadn't heard from in years. The text was cryptic but urgent, "Your father's in trouble. Get to the old train station, now." Elijah's pulse quickened. He'd just wrapped up a case in the neighboring town and was heading home for what he hoped would be a rare evening of rest. But this message erased any thoughts of relaxation. He grabbed the phone and quickly dialed the number. Hello. The voice on the other end was shaky, a mixture of fear and urgency. What's going on? What's wrong with my father? Elijah demanded, his FBI training forcing him to stay calm despite the storm brewing inside him. There's a cop, the neighbor stammered. He's doing something to your dad. You've got to hurry. I didn't want to call the police, I don't trust them, but you can handle it, right? Elijah didn't wait for more details. He slammed his foot on the gas, his mind racing as fast as his car. His father was no stranger to standing up for himself, but Samuel was an old man now. Whatever was happening, Elijah knew it wasn't good. Back at the station, Reynolds stood with his arms crossed, watching Samuel as if he were admiring a piece of art he'd created. The train was close now, the rhythmic pounding of its wheels growing louder with every second. You've got about a minute left, Reynolds said, his voice dripping with mockery. Any last words? Samuel raised his head, his dark eyes piercing through Reynolds. One day, you'll answer for this, he said quietly. Maybe not today, but justice always comes. Reynolds let out a sharp laugh. Justice? What do you know about justice? People like you don't get justice, you get what I decide you get. Samuel didn't reply. He closed his eyes, tuning out the sound of the train and focusing instead on the memory of his wife's smile, the laughter of his son as a boy, and the deep, unshakable belief that no matter what happened to him, the truth would prevail. The train horn blared, and Reynolds took a step back, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He didn't notice the dust cloud rising in the distance, the faint hum of an approaching car cutting through the noise. Elijah's car skidded to a halt just outside the station. He jumped out, his heart hammering in his chest as he took in the scene before him. His father, bound and helpless on the tracks. The train barreling closer. And the officer, smirking, arms crossed, as if he were enjoying a private show. "Dad!" Elijah shouted, sprinting toward the tracks. Reynolds turned, startled. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his hand instinctively reaching for his holstered gun. Elijah ignored him, his eyes fixed on his father. "Hold on, Dad, I'm here," he yelled, his voice cracking with emotion. Reynolds stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice rising. "This is official police business." Elijah stopped just inches from the officer, his jaw clenched and his fists tight at his sides. "That's my father," he said through gritted teeth. "Untie him. Now." Reynolds smirked, recognizing the badge clipped to Elijah's belt. "Oh, an FBI agent," he sneered. "Well, guess what, Agent? This is my jurisdiction, and you don't get to tell me what to do." Elijah's eyes burned with fury, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You've got about 10 seconds to untie him, or I'll make sure you never wear that badge again." Reynolds scoffed. "You don't scare me. You're just another suit who thinks he can." The train horn blared again, louder this time, cutting him off. Elijah didn't wait. He shoved past Reynolds with a force that sent the officer stumbling back, then dropped to his knees beside his father. His hands moved quickly, working the knots loose even as the train's roar grew deafening. "You're gonna be okay, Dad," Elijah said, his voice tight with determination. "I've got you." Samuel opened his eyes, his face etched with relief and gratitude. "I knew you'd come," he whispered. The final knot came undone, and Elijah pulled his father off the tracks just as the train thundered past, its wind whipping around them like a storm. The two men collapsed onto the gravel, Elijah's arm wrapped protectively around Samuel's shoulders. Reynolds, regaining his composure, stormed toward them. "You just interfered with a police operation," he shouted, his face red with anger. "You're gonna regret this." Elijah stood, his body towering over the smaller man. "A police operation," he repeated, his voice cold and steady. "You tied an innocent man to train tracks. That's not law enforcement, that's attempted murder." Reynolds opened his mouth to retort but faltered under Elijah's glare. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. "This isn't over," Reynolds muttered, retreating a step. "I'll make sure you pay for this." Elijah took a step forward, his presence unshakable. "The only one paying for anything here is you," he said, his voice like steel. "And I promise, you're going to answer for everything you've done." Reynolds turned and stalked back to his car, his shoulders tense. But Elijah wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, his eyes never leaving the retreating officer. "It's me," he said when the line connected. "I need an internal affairs team at the old train station immediately. And bring backup. This isn't just one bad cop, we're dealing with something bigger." As he ended the call, Elijah glanced down at his father, who was now sitting up and breathing more steadily. "We're gonna make this right," Elijah said softly. "No one gets away with hurting you. Not on my watch." Samuel nodded, his eyes filled with quiet pride. But the battle was far from over. Elijah could feel it, the storm was only beginning. And when it broke, it would take down everything in its path. The hum of the room was electric with tension. Inside the precinct's small interrogation chamber, the air felt thick, suffocating. Elijah sat at the metal table, his presence calm but commanding, the weight of his father's ordeal pressing heavily on his shoulders. Across from him, Mark Reynolds slouched, his once defiant posture crumbling under the invisible weight of accountability. His badge, stripped from him minutes earlier, lay cold and tarnished on the table between them, a stark reminder of the power he no longer wielded. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" Reynolds sneered, though his voice lacked the bite it had carried at the train tracks. "Dragging me in here like I'm a criminal." Elijah leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "You are a criminal," he said simply, each word deliberate. "What you did wasn't just immoral, it was illegal. And you're going to answer for it." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. "You don't understand," he muttered, his tone defensive now. "People like your father, they push boundaries. They don't respect authority." Elijah's gaze hardened, and his hand slammed onto the table, the sharp sound echoing in the room. "People like my father," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "My father is a retired schoolteacher. A man who spent his entire life giving to his community, raising a son to believe in justice, even when it feels out of reach. And you tied him to a set of train tracks like a villain in some sick movie." His voice cracked, the controlled fury slipping through for just a moment before he reined it back in. "Tell me, Reynolds, who's the one disrespecting authority here?" Reynolds looked away, his jaw tight, but Elijah wasn't done. He pulled a file from the chair beside him and flipped it open, revealing photographs and documents. He slid one across the table, a grainy image of Reynolds standing over another man, his fist clenched around the man's collar. "This is from last year," Elijah said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "You stopped a black man outside a grocery store. No charges were filed, but he reported excessive force. His complaint mysteriously disappeared from the system." Reynolds snorted, but it was weak, almost pitiful. "You think you're gonna sit here and dig through my past? Go ahead. Half the force has records like that. Doesn't mean anything." Elijah stared at him, unblinking. "It means everything," he said softly, sliding another photograph across the table. This one was more recent, a young black teenager with a swollen lip and a gash above his eyebrow. 2 months ago, you pulled over a 16-year-old boy. No citation issued, no reason for the stop. He went home bleeding." Reynolds sat back, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "You think you're better than me? You FBI guys, you act like you're untouchable. But you're just another part of the machine. You don't get it." Elijah shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "You're right. I don't get it. I don't understand how someone takes an oath to protect and serve, only to use it as a shield for their own hatred. I don't understand how someone like you thinks they can get away with this forever." The door behind them opened, and a senior investigator stepped in, nodding to Elijah. "We've got everything," she said. "The footage, the statements. It's enough." Reynolds sat up straighter, his eyes darting between the two of them. "What footage?" he asked, his voice laced with panic. Elijah let the silence hang in the air for a moment before answering. "The train station had a security camera," he said. "A hidden one. Your entire performance was caught on tape. Every word, every action." Reynolds' face drained of color. "You're bluffing." Elijah smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Am I?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Because in about an hour, that footage is going to be in the hands of the district attorney. And let me tell you, they don't take kindly to attempted murder. Or hate crimes." Reynolds stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "This is a setup," he hissed. "You and your father, this is a damn setup." Elijah rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He was taller than Reynolds, and in that moment, he seemed to tower over him. "The only thing that's been set up here," Elijah said quietly, "is the accountability you've been running from your entire career." The senior investigator stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Reynolds' shoulder. "It's over, Reynolds," she said. "You're under arrest." As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Reynolds struggled, his voice rising in desperation. "This isn't fair. You don't know what it's like out there, dealing with people like him every day." "Stop," Elijah interrupted, his voice like steel. Stop trying to justify your hate. You've spent your whole life hiding behind excuses, but there's nothing left to hide behind now. Reynolds fell silent, his chest heaving as he was led out of the room. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving Elijah alone at the table. He sat down heavily, running a hand over his face. The weight of the day settled over him, but beneath the exhaustion was a quiet sense of victory. His father was safe. The truth was out. And for the first time in a long time, the system had worked the way it was supposed to. But Elijah knew this wasn't the end. It was just one battle in a much larger fight. And as he picked up his phone to call his father, he made a silent promise: he would keep fighting, for his father, for his community, for justice. No matter how long it took. Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank wall of the interrogation room. The small victory felt hollow, its weight tempered by the sheer scope of what Reynolds represented. He wasn't just one man, he was a symptom of a sickness that stretched far beyond this single station, this single act of cruelty. Elijah's phone vibrated on the table, jolting him from his thoughts. He reached for it and saw his father's name on the screen. He answered immediately. "Dad," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of the sharp edges it had carried earlier. "Are you okay?" Samuel's voice on the other end was steady, but tired. "I'm fine, son. I needed to hear your voice." Elijah swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have been there sooner." "I should have." "No," Samuel interrupted gently. "You did everything you could. You always have. What happened out there today, it wasn't your fault. It was his choice. His hate." Elijah closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. "It's hard not to feel like I failed you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't fail me," Samuel said firmly. "You saved me. And more than that, you stood up to him. To all of them. That's what matters." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. "It's not enough, Dad. Taking him down, it's not enough. There are others like him. Too many others." Samuel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone was calm but resolute. "Then you keep fighting, Elijah. Not just for me, but for every man, woman, and child who's ever been made to feel less than. You've got the strength for this. I see it in you." Elijah nodded, though his father couldn't see him. "I'll fight," he said. "I promise." The sound of the door opening pulled his attention away. The senior investigator stepped in, her expression unreadable. She nodded toward him, and Elijah ended the call. "Mr. Harris," she began, her tone formal but not unkind. "Reynolds has started talking." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Already? What's he saying?" She crossed her arms, leaning against the table. "He's trying to shift the blame. Claims he was following orders, that the culture in the precinct encouraged this kind of behavior. He says there's a network of officers who share the same mindset, officers who cover for each other, protect each other." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Of course he's trying to save himself. But that doesn't mean he's lying." She nodded. "Exactly. That's why I wanted to let you know, we're going to dig deeper into this. If there's a larger network, we'll find it. And with Reynolds' cooperation, we might be able to take down more than just him." Elijah studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her sincerity. "And what happens to my father in all of this? He's the victim. Is he going to have to relive this over and over again?" "We'll do our best to minimize that," she assured him. "But we'll need his testimony. Without it, we can't build a strong enough case." Elijah exhaled slowly, nodding. "He'll testify," he said. "We'll do whatever it takes." She hesitated, then added, "You should know, Reynolds is already trying to frame this as a political move. He's claiming he's being targeted because of public pressure, not because of his actions. Elijah let out a bitter laugh. Of course he is. Men like him always play the victim when the spotlight turns on them. She nodded again, her expression grim. We'll keep you updated. As she left the room, Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The anger simmering inside him felt like a wildfire, consuming every ounce of restraint he'd spent years cultivating. This wasn't just about Reynolds anymore. This was about the entire system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. Hours later, Elijah walked into his father's modest home. The smell of freshly brewed tea greeted him, and he found Samuel sitting in the living room, a blanket draped over his knees. His father looked up as he entered, a tired smile breaking across his face. Long day? Samuel asked, his voice warm despite the exhaustion that lingered in his features. Elijah nodded, sinking into the chair across from him. You could say that. Samuel studied him for a moment, then said, You've got that look again. The one you had when you were a boy, trying to figure out how to fix the world. Elijah chuckled softly. I guess some things never change. Samuel leaned forward, his eyes sharp despite his age. You can't carry all of this on your shoulders, Elijah. It'll break you. I have to, Elijah said, his voice firm. Because if I don't, who will? Samuel reached out, placing a hand on his son's knee. You don't have to do it alone. You've got people who believe in you, who'll stand beside you. Don't forget that. Elijah nodded slowly, the weight of his father's words settling over him. Thanks, Dad. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet punctuated by the occasional whistle of the wind outside. But even in the stillness, Elijah's mind raced. The fight was far from over, and he knew it. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the world his father had spent his life believing in. The precinct was quieter now, the echoes of earlier commotion settling into a heavy silence. Reynolds sat alone in his cell, the bravado he'd displayed earlier stripped away. The weight of his actions, and the knowledge of what awaited him, pressed heavily on his shoulders. He shifted uncomfortably on the narrow bench, replaying the events of the day over and over in his mind. Outside the cell block, Elijah was in deep conversation with the senior investigator. The room they occupied was small and dimly lit, a single fluorescent bulb flickering intermittently above them. A stack of files sat between them, each one containing a piece of the puzzle that was slowly coming together. We've confirmed some of what Reynolds said, the investigator began, her tone measured. There's a network, just like he claimed. Officers exchanging information, covering for each other, even planting evidence when it suited them. Elijah's jaw tightened, his hands resting on the edge of the table. How far does it go? Far enough, she replied. We've identified at least 5 other officers in this precinct alone. And based on the reports we've started pulling, it's clear they've been operating this way for years. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. This isn't just about Reynolds anymore. This is about the entire system that allowed him, and others like him, to thrive. She nodded. And dismantling that system isn't going to be easy. There will be pushback, from within the department and outside of it. People don't like to see their institutions questioned. Elijah leaned forward, his voice low but firm. I don't care about the pushback. This has to stop. Not just for my father, but for every person who's been a victim of their abuse. The investigator studied him for a moment, then said, We'll need your father's testimony to move forward. His account is critical in tying Reynolds directly to this case. Elijah hesitated. The thought of his father having to relive the ordeal, recounting every detail, facing potential scrutiny, made his stomach churn. But he knew it was necessary. I'll talk to him, he said finally. But I want him protected. No leaks, no public exposure until we're ready to move forward. You have my word, she replied. Later that evening, Elijah sat across from his father at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Samuel was nursing a cup of tea, his hands steady despite the emotional toll of the past day. "They need your testimony," Elijah began, his voice gentle but direct. "It's the only way to ensure Reynolds, and the others, are held accountable." Samuel set his cup down, his expression thoughtful. "I figured as much," he said quietly. "And I'll do it. Not because they need me, but because it's the right thing to do." Elijah nodded, a mix of relief and admiration washing over him. "I'll be with you every step of the way," he promised. "You won't have to face this alone." Samuel smiled faintly. "I know. I've never been alone, Elijah. Not with you by my side." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Testimonies were taken, evidence was gathered, and the investigation expanded beyond the precinct. The deeper they dug, the more corruption they uncovered. It wasn't just about individual officers, it was about a culture of impunity that had taken root, allowing bad actors to operate without fear of consequences. As the case grew, so did the tension. The media caught wind of the investigation, and soon the story was splashed across every news outlet. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, demanding accountability. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, officers exchanging wary glances and whispered conversations. The weight of scrutiny was palpable, and it was clear that the department was teetering on the edge of implosion. Elijah found himself at the center of it all, balancing his role as an investigator with his personal stake in the case. He spent long hours reviewing evidence, meeting with witnesses, and preparing for the inevitable legal battles that lay ahead. But despite the chaos, he remained focused, his determination unwavering. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing a particularly damning report, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from the senior investigator. "Reynolds wants to talk. He says he has something we need to hear." Elijah frowned, his curiosity piqued. He made his way to the holding area, where Reynolds sat behind a glass partition. The man looked different now, haggard, defeated. Gone was the arrogance that had defined him, in its place was a man who seemed to be grappling with the weight of his choices. "What do you want, Reynolds?" Elijah asked, his tone sharp. Reynolds hesitated, his gaze shifting to the floor. "I know I'm going away for this," he began, his voice quieter than Elijah had ever heard it. "But I'm not going down alone. There are others, higher up. People you haven't even touched yet." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Why tell me this now?" Reynolds looked up, his expression a mixture of bitterness and desperation. "Because they'll hang me out to dry the same way they've done to others before me. If I go down, I'm taking them with me." Elijah studied him for a moment, weighing his words. "Names," he said finally. "If you want to help yourself, you give me names. And proof." Reynolds nodded. "You'll get it. But I want something in return." Elijah crossed his arms. "You don't get to make demands, Reynolds. You're lucky I'm even listening to you." "I'm not asking for much," Reynolds said quickly. "Just protection. Once this goes public, there are people who'll come after me. I'm no good to you dead." Elijah considered this, then said, "You give me everything, every name, every piece of evidence, and I'll see what I can do. But don't think for a second that it'll erase what you've done." Reynolds nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Fair enough." As Elijah left the holding area, his mind was racing. Reynolds' cooperation could blow the case wide open, implicating individuals far beyond the precinct. But it also raised the stakes, making the battle ahead even more perilous. Back at the house, Samuel was waiting for him. The older man could see the tension in his son's face as soon as he walked through the door. "Big day?" Samuel asked, his tone light but knowing. Elijah sighed, sinking into a chair. "You could say that." Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder. Whatever happens, just remember, you've already done more than most would. You've stood up when it mattered. Elijah looked up at his father, his resolve hardening. It's not enough yet, he said. But it will be. The stillness of the night outside contrasted sharply with the storm brewing inside Elijah's mind. He sat across from Samuel in the quiet of their living room, the two men lost in thought. The dim light of a single lamp cast long shadows across the walls, giving the space a somber, reflective atmosphere. I spoke with Reynolds today, Elijah said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but the tension in his posture betrayed the weight of his words. Samuel looked up, his expression unreadable. And what did he say? He wants to cooperate, Elijah replied. Claims he has information on people higher up, officers, maybe even city officials, who've been covering for him and others like him. Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. And do you believe him? Elijah exhaled, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. I don't know. He's desperate. He's trying to save himself, so it's hard to tell where the truth ends and self-preservation begins. But if there's even a chance he's telling the truth, it could change everything. Samuel studied his son carefully, his face a mix of pride and concern. You've always been good at finding the truth, Elijah. If anyone can see through his lies, it's you. Elijah smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. It's not just about the truth anymore, Dad. It's about the cost of exposing it. The deeper I dig, the more I realize how much is at stake. This isn't just about Reynolds or even this precinct, it's bigger than that. And if we push too hard, too fast, I don't know what might happen. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in his lap. You're afraid of the consequences, he said, his tone gentle but probing. I'm afraid of what happens to the people caught in the crossfire, Elijah admitted. To you. To anyone who stands up and says enough is enough. People don't give up power easily, Dad. And when they feel threatened, they fight back. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the flickering lamp. Then, he spoke, his voice steady. You're right. They do fight back. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting. You've been given a chance to do something most people can't, to shine a light where there's been darkness for far too long. Don't let fear keep you from doing what's right. Elijah nodded, the weight of his father's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. I won't, he said softly. I just hope it's enough. The next morning, Elijah met with the senior investigator and the team leading the case. The air in the briefing room was charged with a mix of anticipation and unease as they reviewed the information Reynolds had provided. Names, dates, and documents were spread across the table, painting a picture of a network that was larger and more entrenched than any of them had anticipated. It's worse than we thought, the investigator said, her voice low. This isn't just about a few bad cops. This is systemic. There are people in positions of power, judges, council members, even state officials, who've been complicit in keeping this quiet. Elijah's jaw tightened as he scanned the files. How far can we take this? He asked. If we go after all of them, it's going to be a war. The investigator met his gaze, her expression resolute. Then we go to war, she said. But we do it carefully. We need airtight evidence, rock-solid testimonies, and a plan to protect everyone involved. If even one piece of this falls apart, the whole case could collapse. Elijah nodded, his mind already racing with the logistics of what needed to be done. Reynolds is our starting point, he said. But we can't rely on him alone. We need to corroborate everything he's given us. Over the next few days, Elijah and the team worked tirelessly, cross-referencing Reynolds' claims with existing evidence and gathering new information. The deeper they dug, the more corruption they uncovered, and the scope of the case grew with each passing hour. It was exhausting, grueling work, but Elijah's determination never wavered. One evening, as he was leaving the precinct, Elijah's phone rang. He answered quickly, recognizing the number as one of the team's informants. "They know," the voice on the other end said, trembling with fear. "They know what you're doing. You need to be careful." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "Who knows?" he asked, his voice sharp. "The people at the top," the informant replied. "The ones Reynolds talked about. They're watching you, Elijah. They're watching everyone involved in this case." Elijah clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the phone. "Thank you for letting me know," he said. "Stay safe. We'll take it from here." As he hung up, a cold chill ran down his spine. The fight was no longer just about uncovering the truth, it was about surviving the consequences of exposing it. That night, Elijah sat with Samuel again, the two men sharing a quiet dinner. The weight of the day hung heavily over Elijah, but he didn't want to burden his father with the details. "You look tired," Samuel said, his voice laced with concern. "More than usual." Elijah smiled faintly, picking at his plate. "It's just the case," he said. "There's a lot to sort through." Samuel reached across the table, placing a hand on his son's. "You don't have to protect me, Elijah. I can see it in your eyes, this isn't just about the work. Something's wrong." Elijah hesitated, then sighed. "They're pushing back, Dad. The people we're going after, they know what we're doing. And they're not going to let it happen without a fight." Samuel's expression hardened, his grip on Elijah's hand tightening. "Let them push. Let them fight. But don't you dare back down. Not now." Elijah nodded, the determination in his father's voice bolstering his own resolve. "I won't," he promised. "No matter what." The days that followed were a blur of activity and tension. As the case moved closer to its climax, the risks grew exponentially. Threats, both subtle and overt, began to surface, and the pressure to succeed mounted with each passing moment. But through it all, Elijah remained focused. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew that the stakes had never been higher. And as he prepared for the battles still to come, he carried with him the strength of his father's belief and the unshakable resolve to see justice prevail. The pressure in the air was tangible, like the thick humidity before a thunderstorm. Elijah sat in the secure conference room at the FBI's regional office, a pile of documents spread out before him. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, a habit that betrayed his otherwise calm demeanor. Across from him, the senior investigator, Agent Moore, was briefing the team on the latest developments. "The leak came from within," Moore said, her voice clipped but calm. "Someone tipped off the higher-ups were investigating. They've started closing ranks, shredding documents, and silencing people who could testify." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Do we know who the mole is?" Moore shook her head. "Not yet. But it's clear they're scared. That means we're close." One of the younger agents, a fresh recruit named Lopez, chimed in hesitantly. "Close is good, but it's also dangerous. If they're this desperate, they won't stop at covering their tracks. They'll come after us." Elijah glanced at Lopez, his gaze steady. "That's why we're here, to stand between them and the people who can't fight back. If we don't take this to the finish line, no one will." Lopez nodded, swallowing hard. Moore stepped in, her commanding presence grounding the room. "Elijah's right. But we need to be smart. We can't afford mistakes. Every move from here on out has to be calculated." "Understood." A chorus of murmured agreements followed, and Moore turned to Elijah. "Reynolds is ready to talk again. He says he has more names, but he's demanding an updated deal. Wants protection for his family." Elijah rubbed his temples, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Reynolds has done nothing but make demands since this started. We're giving him protection, what more does he want?" Moore shrugged. "He knows he's the centerpiece of this case. He's leveraging it. But if his information pans out, it could be worth it. Elijah stood, his chair scraping against the floor. I'll talk to him. The holding area was dimly lit, the stark fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Reynolds was seated at a metal table, his wrists cuffed to a steel loop. His face was gaunt, his confidence a distant memory. When Elijah entered, Reynolds looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Agent Harris," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Come to renegotiate?" Elijah sat across from him, his expression unreadable. "I'm here to listen. But let's get one thing straight, you're in no position to bargain. You give us what we need, or you can rot in here. Your choice." Reynolds scoffed, though it lacked conviction. "You think I'm the bad guy here. But you don't know the half of it. The people at the top, they don't play fair. They'll destroy anyone who gets in their way." Elijah leaned forward, his tone sharp. "And you think that justifies what you've done? You tied an innocent man to train tracks. You terrorized people who couldn't fight back. Don't talk to me about fairness." Reynolds flinched, his gaze dropping to the table. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. "There's always a choice," Elijah countered. "You chose hate. You chose violence. But now, you have a chance to make a different choice. So what's it going to be?" Reynolds was silent for a moment, his hands fidgeting in the cuffs. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a judge, Samuelson. He's been covering for dirty cops for years. Dismissing cases, suppressing evidence. He's the reason nothing ever sticks." Elijah's heart quickened. A judge involved in the corruption was a game-changer. "Do you have proof?" he asked, his voice steady. Reynolds nodded. "Emails, phone records. They're stored on an encrypted server. I can give you the location, but you'll need someone to crack it." Elijah stood, his mind already racing. "If this pans out, you might have a sliver of a chance at redemption. But don't think for a second this erases what you've done." Reynolds didn't respond, his shoulders slumping as Elijah left the room. Back in the conference room, Elijah relayed the information to Moore and the team. The atmosphere was tense but charged with determination. "We need to move fast," Moore said. "If Samuelson catches wind of this, he'll bury everything." Elijah nodded. "I'll lead the team. We'll get the evidence." The raid on the server location was swift and surgical. Elijah and his team moved with precision, securing the building and retrieving the data. The encrypted files were handed off to the cyber division, who worked tirelessly to crack the codes. Hours turned into days, but when the files were finally decrypted, the scope of the corruption was staggering. Emails revealed a web of complicity that stretched beyond the precinct. Judges, city council members, even a state senator, each one implicated in shielding dirty cops and profiting from the system's failures. As the team reviewed the evidence, the weight of their discovery began to sink in. This wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning. "We have everything we need," Moore said, her voice filled with both relief and resolve. "It's time to bring them down." But Elijah wasn't celebrating yet. He knew the battle was far from over. The people they were targeting wouldn't go quietly, and the fallout would be immense. That night, as he returned to his father's house, the gravity of the situation finally hit him. Samuel was waiting for him, as he always was, a comforting presence in the midst of chaos. "You did it, didn't you?" Samuel asked, his voice quiet but sure. Elijah nodded, sinking into the chair across from him. "We found the proof. All of it." Samuel smiled faintly, pride shining in his eyes. "You've come a long way, Elijah. From the boy who used to chase fireflies in the backyard to the man who's changing the world." Elijah chuckled softly, though his smile didn't last. "It doesn't feel like enough, Dad." "Not yet." "It's never enough," Samuel said. "But it's a start. And sometimes, that's all you need." As the two men sat in the quiet of the evening, Elijah allowed himself a moment of reflection. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that justice, though hard-fought, was within reach. The courtroom was packed, the air buzzing with tension as the final verdicts were read. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled notes, and every eye was trained on the front of the room where the judge presided over the case that had captured national attention. Elijah sat quietly in the gallery, his father at his side, both men holding their breaths as the moment they had fought so hard for finally arrived. On the charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice and abuse of power, the judge announced, her voice clear and unwavering, the defendants are found guilty. A ripple of emotion swept through the room. Some gasped, others whispered, and a few cheered softly. The once powerful figures who had orchestrated the corruption, Judge Samuelson, several police officers, and high-ranking officials, sat with their heads bowed, their fates sealed by the overwhelming evidence Elijah and his team had uncovered. Reynolds was among them, his face pale but emotionless. He had played his role in bringing the truth to light, but his own actions could not be excused. The judge turned her attention to him specifically. As for Officer Mark Reynolds, for your crimes of attempted murder, abuse of authority, and participation in systemic corruption, you are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, she declared. Elijah didn't flinch, his expression stoic as he watched the man who had nearly cost his father's life be led away in handcuffs. Samuel placed a hand on his son's arm, a silent gesture of pride and gratitude. When the courtroom finally emptied, Elijah and Samuel stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. Protesters and supporters alike had gathered, their voices blending into a cacophony of cheers, chants, and demands for change. Elijah shielded his eyes from the sun as he took in the scene. You did it, Samuel said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You stood up when it mattered most. Elijah turned to his father, a small smile breaking across his face. We did it, he corrected. I couldn't have done this without you. Samuel chuckled softly. I didn't do much, Elijah. I just stayed alive long enough to see this day. The two men embraced briefly, their bond stronger than ever. As they stepped into the crowd, people began to approach Elijah, shaking his hand, thanking him for his courage. A young boy, no older than 10, tugged at his sleeve. Are you the man who put the bad guys away? The boy asked, his wide eyes filled with admiration. Elijah knelt down to meet his gaze. I helped, he said simply. But there were a lot of people who made this happen. The boy nodded solemnly. My mom says you're a hero. Elijah's smile widened, but his voice remained humble. Your mom's the real hero. She's raising a good kid like you. As the boy beamed and ran back to his mother, Samuel leaned in and whispered, You're building something, Elijah. Something bigger than yourself. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the case were felt far and wide. The convictions sent shockwaves through the justice system, forcing other precincts and officials to reevaluate their practices. Investigations were launched, policies were revised, and for the first time in years, many felt that real change was within reach. Reynolds, now serving his sentence, became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when power is abused and accountability is ignored. He kept to himself in prison, his days marked by regret and isolation. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet, bitter understanding of the choices that had led him there. For Elijah, the case opened new doors. He was promoted within the bureau, his reputation as a relentless and principled investigator earning him the respect of his peers. But more importantly, he found a renewed sense of purpose. He began working on initiatives to build trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities, determined to be a part of the solution rather than the problem. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his father's house, Elijah reflected on everything they had endured. Samuel joined him, a cup of tea in his hand and a peaceful look on his face. Do you think it's over? Elijah asked, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Samuel shook his head. No, son. It's never over. But you've started something important. And as long as there are people like you willing to fight, there's hope. Elijah nodded, the weight of his father's words settling over him. Then I'll keep fighting, he said. For as long as it takes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the two men sat in silence, united by the unshakable bond of love, resilience, and shared purpose. Now, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've just witnessed. This story isn't just about justice, it's about the courage to stand up against systems of oppression, about the power of resilience, and about the belief that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about people like Samuel, who inspire us with their quiet strength, and people like Elijah, who remind us that the fight for justice is worth every sacrifice. What about you? What would you do if faced with a situation like this? How can each of us contribute to a world where justice isn't just an ideal, but a reality for everyone? Share your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful narratives like this one. Together, we can explore stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the strength we all carry. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.